part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole.
So we had an entirely different movie planned for our 26th episode, but Nicole was gracious enough to let me swap it out for today's pick. During one of my YouTube spirals, I saw a very gorgeous fan vid made about this movie, and since I have not known peace since Baron Zemo returned to The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, today's episode is brought to you by Daniel Bruhl's existence.
By Daniel Bruhl's existence and my willingness to let Maggie do what she wants. Oh, man. So The Countess is quite a film. It was released in 2009, which explains, I guess, why I'd never seen it, because I was in either 8th or 9th grade, depending on what time of year it came out. This is interesting. It's a French and German film made in English. But it is a biopic with gothic horror elements, is how I've seen it described. And it's about the life of the Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory. Is that how they say it?
Bathory? Yeah.
I know nothing about how to pronounce names in Hungarian, so this is going to be a really interesting episode. But the movie was written and directed by Julie Delpy, who also composed the score and also starred in the leading role, the definition of doing everything for the group project. It also stars Daniel Bruhl, obviously, and William Hurt. And I think it's interesting, this was Delpy's, I believe, 3rd film that she directed, so she was still fairly early in her time as a director whenever she made this, and she's made several more movies since then.
Yes. So I am going to give my initial reactions to The Countess. So about 15 minutes into the movie, I had a startling revelation, and I realized I had a bootleg copy of this movie that I used only the dance scene from for fan videos. Because back circa 2009 to 2012, I was part of this period drama collab channel on YouTube, and we would do mashup fan videos of different period dramas, and I think someone had suggested this movie for just that dance. And so I used it, and I never watched the whole movie because I just scene select it. So it was quite startling. This is now the 2nd time that I've realized I've seen parts of movies that Daniel Bruhl was in, but never fully watched them, just used him doing something for another character. So terribly sorry. Now, I know that Nicole is not the biggest fan of this film, but for me, it was a pretty solid 7.5, 8 out of 10. This is really right up my alley, strangely, from the cinematography to the costuming to the plot and even the kind of ambiguous nature of the story. If I had actually watched this to completion in 2009, this probably would have been right up there among my favorites. I am, after all, the girl who is still fondly attached to the Tudors and the Borgias. Please do not judge me. And carefully notice that I omitted what we discussed before the episode.
I'm proud of you.
Dear listeners, be glad that I am sparing you my actual notes from while I was watching this movie, because it was a wild ride. Basically, Ishvin Thurzo is my new love. I will not be taking questions at this time. When Elizabeth asked if she inspired fear in him, I was like, oh, I weirdly relate to that as a woman who has been told by countless men that I scare them and inspire fear in them. So I don't know how I should feel to see myself in Elizabeth Bartroy.
I'm suddenly terrified.
I mean, I did tweet last night that I'm starting to get wrinkles and I'm concerned.
I want to clarify to anyone listening that she tweeted that before watching the film.
100%. I had literally no idea. I thought this was about a different countess. So did not know the subject matter of this movie.
I also feel like it's worth noting that this is another one of those movies that we committed
To not
doing
research.
an episode on. Yeah, without having any idea what it was about. Which, you know.
The pretty fan video that I watched, did not have any of the blood and gore.
You don't say.
It was just Daniel Bruhl and the Countess looking pretty, and I was like, ooh, this has a nice filter over it. It's in high def. It looks nice. I will say the intensity of that dance. Is it a period drama if there isn't a sexually charged dance?
No.
There is so much said without a single word. I sat there watching the whole thing, like biting my nails. I'm like, this is such an intense dance scene. I loved it. I have so many notes. I'm so sorry, Nicole.
It's okay. I'm enjoying this. So.
Okay. So there's a moment when you're watching this movie, if you watch it with subtitles, which I highly suggest, there's a piece of dialogue that just like kind of lingers from the previous scene, and it says, "I've never felt this way," and it's over this very specific scene, and all I can say is same.
I love this for you.
It's great.
Love this for you.
It's so great. I'm just going to skip that note. I'm not going to say that one out loud. Okay, so I don't even remember what Elizabeth's like whipping boy's name is, but he looks like he belongs in Lazy Town. I don't know if you ever watched that kids show, but like,
oh my god, he does.
Get this Lazy Town man off my screen. Bring back Ishvin. I feel so bad for this actor because he just the costuming and like the hair and the role just did absolutely nothing for him. But his jawline was a Lazy Town villain.
I'm so glad that you did not tell me, like, that you watched this after me, and I did not have to know that as I watched it.
You really can't unsee it.
Okay, because the thing is, whenever I was watching it, I was like, oh, he reminds me vaguely of something, and now I realize it is, like,
the guy from Lazy Town.
Lazy Town, yeah. But, wow.
And then, like, aside from all of my fangirling here, I really love that for once this is a period film where an older woman is losing her mind over a younger man that she loved, rather than just some random dude losing his mind over some young girl that he's fallen in love with and can't have. Like, for all of its, like, issues, and there are plenty of issues with the story, I just was glad to see that because I feel like that's not something that is ever touched on, even though it certainly happened in history. And then, of course, we have, we love to see a serial killer lady. She's a boss babe. And I know Nicole has a much better commentary on that when she gets to her notes. And then later on in the episode, we're going to get into this a little bit more. But while I was watching this, I couldn't help but think that, like, some part of this had to be because she was a Protestant and a Catholic country, and like there's that dialogue at the beginning with the bishop where I just wanted to punch the bishop in the face. That whole scene was so interesting, and I went back and I rewatched it because I wondered how much of that scene was setting up what happens in the later half of the film, because of course Ishvin's father's there and everything, that's all the players, which I thought was interesting. But I really liked how the film starts and ends with Ishvin saying that he only knows what's been told to him by others. And it really lends to this idea that since he begins narrating after they're separated, that the rest of the film is just him retelling what's been told by others and, the story that's been told by the victors. So then like everything from their separation to when they're reunited these 5 years later, when the charges are leveled against him, are basically up to ambiguity. But, all of that to be said, I'm just disappointed that we don't have more vampire stories inspired by Elizabeth Bartry. I feel like we have been deprived of something really fun.
Well, in recent years, because I did look at it, and like a lot of early vampire lore is actually based around her, and the myths around her, which is very interesting. But yeah, obviously, so Maggie liked this movie a lot more than I did. I And I looked at it on Letterboxd, and I think a lot of people felt the way that I did about it, which is that like it's not a bad movie. It just is not a great movie, and it's kind of a boring movie for the story that it's telling.
I was riveted, just so we're clear.
Babe, I know why you were riveted.
You don't say.
Yeah.
It was the boss babe serial killer. What are you talking about?
Of course. But no, this is like whenever you start to look into the actual woman, this is a very wild story, and that doesn't like fully come across in it, honestly. Especially because I don't know, I also just have some thoughts around the fact that like this is a very interesting story about a woman who either was this absolutely depraved, sadistic monster who, if she truly did what she was accused of, holds the Guinness Book of World Record for female serial killers. That's a fun fact. Or she's this woman who was a powerful Protestant woman who was horribly taken down by men close to her. Who were certainly complicit in it, if that's what occurred. And instead they give us this story that plays into a lot of the myth, but also kind of tries to have it both ways and be like, well, like, it's from this point of view of this character who's like, this is what I was told about her. But it doesn't like fully lean into that, but also then centers the entire thing around this imagined affair. So I don't know, I just have some issues with that from like a female historian perspective. Also, it's one of those things where I'm like, I actually think that the real story is maybe more interesting than the story that they came up with, which, as you know, is one of my like pet peeves for a period drama. But I will say that moment when she first sees like young Daniel Bruhl, I was like, me too, girl, me too.
I love the fact that when I was reading, I found the like press packet for the movie when it came out in 2009, and I read like all the interviews and stuff. But the fact that Julie and Daniel had worked on something previous to this, and then after they worked on that movie, she was like, I have a role that's perfect for you. And I was like, oh, you looked at him and was like, yes.
Yep.
I have found my Ishvin.
I also will say, there's a moment, a bit of a like, look, if we get a sexually charged dance scene in a period drama, like what else can we really ask for? I wanted more of that if that's what this was gonna do. Like, I also think part of it is that like you don't really get much time with the two of them together to sell you on the romance of it, which
you just get her staring at him while he's asleep.
Yeah, right. I was like, okay, lady. Some of the effects around violence in this movie are also like laughably bad. Like, there's an early shot whenever they're showing her husband off at war, and he like is supposed to like behead someone
so swiftly.
You could like clearly see the effect in it. Like, ooh, bad. There's Jesus. This movie is like, on one hand, it does not lean nearly as far into the whole like gothic horror as it could have.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, that means that like there's these weird moments tonally where suddenly it's like very gruesome. Like, okay, the scene of her like sewing the lock of hair like into her
She wanted
dress.
to keep him over her heart forever.
That was disgusting. I was like, are you really gonna make me watch? Like, they kept like zooming in, and I was like, can we not zoom in, maybe? Like, I get the point.
Julie said, please look at my boob while I'm sewing it.
Literally. Also, the scene with the wolf in the forest.
Mm-hmm. The wolves were so beautiful, and then I had to go and do that.
Yeah, right? I was like, ooh, wolves, I love this. Is this some nice, like, imagery? And then they were like, no, it's eating a corpse. And I was like, oh, okay. Although I will say, like, it is a weird thing, like I said, that most of the, like, really gruesome violence is told to you rather than shown to you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, in the small bit of the trial at the end, which, I don't know, just feels a little bit like a weird choice to me. To give us, like, some of it, but then not all of it. The whole, like, Dom subplot with her lover.
Lazy Town.
Is okay, it's a very bizarre choice. Considering that in all my research on her, I could not find anything on any sort of affairs that she may have had. Which isn't to say that she didn't, of course, but it just means that, like, it feels weird that they invented, like, not one, but two lovers for her. And I still am not positive what LazyTown's purpose in this whole thing was.
Also, like, I felt like the Dom sub, I hate saying that, plot line
Yep.
felt like this
There's
conflation.
no other way to describe
There
it,
is
though.
no way, but it felt like a conflation of sadism and BDSM that felt like a weird line that should not have been played with. Like,
Yep.
yeah,
Exactly.
if you like being whipped, you probably kill people and smear blood on your face. Like,
Exactly.
no, Julie, that's not how it works.
Exactly. You see, okay, you understand.
No,
my
like
reservations
I said,
with this
there's
movie.
like definitely things that I was like, that was a choice.
Yep. And I will say, like, the cinematography is lovely, the costumes are lovely, the sets, the music composed by
It's
Julie
gorgeous.
Delpy, very lovely. Some of the acting's good. The leads are good. Some of the acting in this movie is incredibly wooden. Every child actor in this movie, if you told me they never acted again, I would not be surprised. Like, and I don't mean like the actual children, I mean like the teenage actors in it. Bad. In particular, the younger, not the youngest version of the Countess that we see, but like the middle one. I was like, ooh, that's painful.
Oh yes.
Just painful. I mean, Julie Delpy's fantastic in it, though, and I think she's a very talented actress, much more so than a director.
Mm-hmm.
Which, to be fair, like, she's been acting a lot longer than she's been directing. But I reviewed her most recent film last year, By Zoe, and it was definitely better written than this. I still had a lot of issues with it. I think that her films tend to, at least from what I've seen, have issues in that, like, it feels like they're not totally cohesive. Like, suddenly in the last, like, 30 minutes, they'll be like, here's some themes. And I'm like, well, I would have liked those to go through the whole movie, but thank you.
It's like, here's your goodie bag to go home with.
Literally kind of how this movie felt. It was like, and now, at the very last minute, feminism. And I was like, what? Okay. But I saw someone on Letterboxd say that this movie is the definition of, like, gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss, and that's
Love
true.
it so much.
Like, it definitely tries to be like, it definitely tries to girl boss a serial killer. And then at the last minute be like, or maybe she wasn't, XOXO, Gossip Girl. Which, it was a choice. Like, it does sort of play with this idea of, like, what is myth versus what is the truth. Like, in the beginning, he's all like, history is a tale told by the victors, but who are the victors? But it really fails to fully take a side. And I just kind of wish that it had either gone, like, full gothic horror and been like, this is the myth of the bloody countess. Or it had fully shown us the way in which, like, these men manipulated the situation instead of taking this sort of weird middle ground. Yeah, I don't know. It just really didn't work for me. But it's like a well-made film. I don't think it's a well-written film. I think all my issues really come from the writing of it. And I didn't really know that much about, Elizabeth Bathory going into it. And now that I've done some research, which I will share in a bit, I'm fascinated by her. And it's one of those sort of, like, mysteries in history that, like, we'll never know the truth. We will never know if this woman is actually, like, the most prolific female serial killer or a woman who got, like, screwed over by the patriarchy. I mean, I have feelings about, like, what I actually think was the truth. But it is one of those weird things whenever you look at historic figures and you're like, wow, we'll never know. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's so interesting because, like, I told my mom after I watched it, I was like, oh, I just watched this movie about the Countess. And she was like, which Countess? And I was like, the serial killer one. She's like, oh, Elizabeth Bartry. And I was like, how do you just know? And then I had a conversation with somebody else and I was like, yeah, it's about this, like, Countess that killed people. And they're like, yeah, Elizabeth Bartry. I'm like, why did no one? This is, like, very, like, a perfect niche of my interests. And nobody thought to tell me about this ever in my life. Like, everyone who has ever known me just, like, completely disregarded my interest in, like, weird murder women doing weird murder and like 16th, 17th, like century history. Like everyone just left me in the dark. That's cool. Love that for us.
I wanted, and I almost never say this about a movie, but like I wanted more murder.
I wanted more murder too. As a word of advice, please do not try to beat her Guinness Book of World Record. As Wikipedia says, do not commit crimes to add yourself to the list of serial killers.
Oh my god. Oh my god.
I had such a blast researching her today. I feel, like I said, gypped that I never had the opportunity to research her before today. Like, if I had known she existed, I would probably be finding biographies about her like I have Jack the Ripper books, you know? Because this is just very much like my niche, especially like the mystery surrounding it. Like, I have a huge passion for like the myth of Jack the Ripper because there's so much that we don't know and will never know about who Jack the Ripper is. And I feel like Elizabeth's story has a very similar nature to it, where there's like all of this crime that has been applied to her that might have had nothing to do with her. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Maybe it was somebody else in the castle. We'll never actually know. And I love that. I love a good mystery like that. And the myths are just so heinous. And now I'm going to talk about them. So while her husband was away fighting against the Ottoman Empire, rumors began to swirl that Elizabeth tortured her servants. After her husband's death, these rumors shifted into rumors of murder.
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 I couldn't help that one, sorry.
There were 3 lines of rumors about who she was killing. First, it was servants that came to work at her castle. Second, it was the daughters of gentry that were sent to be educated at the castle. And thirdly, that she kidnapped girls and brought them to the castle. Allegedly, she performed these heinous acts for a period of 6 years before Giorgi Thorozo, at the behest of the king, came to investigate. He gathered over 300 witness statements that seemed to prove that she had been behind all of these heinous murders. He charged her for 80 of the girls' deaths, but there were allegedly over 600 linked to Elizabeth. Content warning. If you're squeamish, skip ahead a few seconds because these alleged torture tactics of Elizabeth's makes Jigsaw sound tame. According to witness statements, Bartry burned her victims with hot irons, beat them to death with clubs, stuck needles under their fingernails and cut the skin between their fingers, placed them in ice baths and left them to freeze to death outside, covered them in honey so that bugs could feast on their exposed skin, bit chunks of flesh out of their breasts and faces, sewed their lips together so they couldn't eat, and used scissors to torture her victims by cutting off their hands, noses, and genitalia. One line that you might recognize from the movie is that Thorozo claimed that one of the witnesses had seen her having sex with the devil. If that list of heinous torture wasn't enough to sour your stomach, Elizabeth was also alleged to have bathed in the blood of her victims so that she could retain her youth. Please do not try this at home. Interestingly enough, the accounts of her bathing in the blood of virgins didn't actually start to come up until 100 years after her death, so I don't think that's true. And just to like really prove the hypocrisy of what was going on, her servants were tortured into making their confessions, and her wet nurse was accused of witchcraft, and all of her alleged accomplices were executed violently. So, pot calling the kettle black much? In reality, what I think is that she was conspired against because she was Protestant, a widowed woman with incredible political sway. This was a period of a lot of political turmoil and upheaval, and the monarchy was kind of in danger. So it wouldn't be unsurprising that given her husband's success during the war and their money and land holdings that people were worried about what she might do and if she did remarry. Her neighbors, daughters, and relatives all benefited from her downfall. But Nicole's going to get into the truth of the Countess.
All right. So she's one of those interesting figures, and that partially because she's a woman, partially because of just the time period. A lot of the facts that we know about her are a bit sketchy. And sources, really differ. But she was born on August 7th in 1560 in Hungary. She obviously is very famous for being this countess who supposedly tortured and murdered hundreds of young women, but she was born into a prominent Hungarian noble family. Her family controlled Transylvania, which is an interesting coincidence. Or is it a coincidence? Her uncle was the king of Poland. One thing I found interesting was one source I was reading said that she may have suffered from epilepsy as a child, due to the fact that she was very inbred. Yeah. Which was treated at the time, in some places, it was referred to as the falling sickness, and it was treated with the blood of a non-sufferer.
Oh, well, there you go.
So, and, is that true? Is there a coincidence? Is it somebody trying to explain where she got this idea of, blood? I don't know. A lot of this is kind of I don't know. But there's really no evidence that she was raised in ways of cruelty or Satanism or witchcraft, as the legends go in the film shows us.
You mean to tell me she didn't bury a bird in a pot and wondered why it wouldn't grow?
Jesus, that was terrifying. She was raised in as a Calvinist Protestant. And as a young girl, she was considered very beautiful and she was very well educated. She knew 4 languages. There were rumors that she gave birth to an illegitimate child at the age of 13, as we see in the movie, from a dalliance with a peasant boy. That is almost certainly not true. Those only started to circulate after she got accused of everything else, so it seems unlikely. But in 1575, at the age of 15, she was married to the Count Ferenc Nadasdy, who is from another prominent Hungarian family. They'd been betrothed when she was 10 years old. This one source I was looking at, and again, take all of this with a grain of salt because things contradict each other, but she refused to change her last name because she said her rank was higher than his. And so he actually used her name sometimes, which is incredible. But her husband's family gifted them the Castle Kastis, where they moved in together after their marriage. 10 years happen, where there's nothing notable that occurs really. But then from 1585 to 1595, she gives birth to 5 children, maybe 4 children, maybe 6 children. It's a little unclear. We're going to go with 5. 2 of these kids died as infants, and then 2 daughters and a son survived to adulthood. Which the children also are, I think, older than we're shown them being. Whenever she gets accused, both daughters were already married. Her husband was the commander of the Hungarian army, so they spent most of their marriage apart because he was off fighting the Ottoman Turks. He dies in 1604, and she takes over the estates, and she is suddenly in charge of a vast amount of land and money. So, obviously, as you said earlier, it's around this time that the rumors start to fly. Now, we really don't know that much about her, actual fact-wise, other than we do know that the king of Hungary, Matthias, sends Thurzo, who may have been her cousin, according to some sources, which puts another interesting spin onto all of this, to investigate. But Thurzo was the Lord Palatine, not to be confused with Palpatine, of Hungary. And he was sent to inquire about the mistreatment of the noblewomen. What I found interesting about that was, basically they were hey, you can murder peasant women and servants, as much as you want, but we're starting to hear that these girls who are sent to you to be educated are getting murdered, and we can't really let that go. Love that. Love that. They were like, if you want to kill some peasant lady, so like you do you, girl. Like, girl boss it up. Um, but like you said, he takes all these depositions. There's also rumors of a diary in which she kept names of her victims, supposedly like totaling 650. But if that ever did exist, they never found it. Um, Again, details get very weird here. It's in December of either 1609 or 1610 that Thurzo accuses Elizabeth and her servants of all of these murders. Now, because she's so highborn, they don't actually arrest her, and she's never tried. But they put 4 servants on trial. 3 of these servants are executed. 3 women and 1 man are put on trial. One of the women is not executed, but nobody knows what happens to her. They all denied being involved in the torture and the murder, but they did admit to burying the victims, which I find interesting. Essentially, they start torturing them, and they're all trying to like pin the blame on each other. The number of victims, so that they admit to burying, like doesn't match up. And then a 4th woman who worked in the castle is accused of using magic to help Elizabeth, and she is also executed. It wasn't until much later that this idea that she was doing anything sort of to maintain youth or beauty or whatever comes about. At the time, basically they're just accusing her of being like a terrible person and a sadistic person. And there are some weird places where it is implied that there is an element of sexuality to it. Which is why it's kind of a weird thing that they put that into the movie. Yeah. But so she's never tried. She just gets confined to her chambers in her family castle, the one that she was given for her wedding, where she remains until her death a few years later. Now, there's sort of this idea that she's like sealed into her room or something, but there are accounts from priests who visited her that she had free reign of the whole house. So she was basically just under house arrest, which, if you're accused of murdering over 600 people, getting put under house arrest in your castle is a pretty good fate, if you ask me.
Yeah.
But she does die on August 21st of 1614 in Castle Castige. She appears to have died of natural causes. There's certainly no talk of at the time of it being suicide or anything like that. Of course, now people really question the veracity of the documents used against her, and there's sort of a couple of different theories. She was owed a large debt by the king of Poland, as we see in the film, sort of in the earlier part, and it was actually canceled by her family in exchange for them to be the ones in charge of her captivity. So some people think the king actually did all of this on purpose to get out of the money that he owed her. Relatives got to take over her lands because she was never formally accused. So some people think that it was actually her relatives who like manufactured all of this because they didn't like that she had so much power and land and they wanted it for themselves. It certainly is true that her son-in-laws knew that her like accusation was coming and did not warn her. So I think that sort of lends some credence to that theory. Another reason that she was sort of a target is that she supported her nephew, Prince Gabor of Transylvania, against the Habsburgs. So obviously that made a lot of enemies for her.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it's important to note that, like, whether or not she was murdering all of these people, she certainly does not seem to be innocent, because way before all of this sort of comes about, there are records of her and her husband, like firsthand accounts of their sort of extreme cruelty towards their servants and towards like villagers in the towns around them. So she certainly was a nasty woman that, like, you can sort of see, if those things were known to be true, how easy it would have been for them to pin all the rest of this on her.
Mm-hmm.
If she already has this sort of reputation for being cruel and mistreating the people who work in her household. So I think it is one of those interesting cases where, like I keep saying, a lot of this is like, I would look at, I looked at multiple different sources and found a lot of conflicting information. But what certainly is true is that although she was accused of these things, there was no solid evidence to any of it other than, your sort of, I don't want to say normal, but like non-serial killer mistreatment of servants. I certainly think that if she had actually killed 600 people,
Probably would have heard about it.
yeah, there would be proof. Like, I don't think you can murder that many people and there not be proof, even if it was happening this, in this time period. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting story. I would love to see something one day, like kind of like a film fully explore sort of how this plot might have been concocted. Like, I'd love to see a movie do a sort of, I almost want to say like an Adam McKay style, like I, Tonya style, with a bit of a like, this is what they said she was doing, this is what she was actually doing type approach to it, because I think that could actually be pretty fun. Because it is like, it's sort of a level of gruesomeness with these accusations where like, you almost have to laugh at it. And that sounds bad, but like, it kind of feels like the accusations that they drummed up against like Anne Boleyn, where it's like, okay, we're truly scraping the bottom of the barrel for what we can accuse this woman of.
Truly.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Well, on like a lighter note, now I get to talk about the pretty costumes. So the costuming for this film was done by our favorite costumer, Pierre-Yves Guéroud, who also did The Promise, Albert Nobbs, and The Three Musketeers. Clearly, Nicole, we are going to have to do Perfume, since that's another one of his, like,
oh god,
really well-known. Now that one I have watched, but like a very long time ago. Again, I use that for fan videos on YouTube. But the costumes in this film evoke everything that you would expect from late 16th, early 17th century Eastern European Germanic nobility. I was really surprised to see how elaborate the costuming was for the servants. They were all dressed very well, and there was like intricate embroidery on their shirts. And I wondered if it had something to do with Elizabeth's earlier line about how she was a woman who loved pretty dresses. I could see her wanting her servants to look a very specific way. I pulled up a translation from an academic who had done some research into Hungarian fashion during this period of time, and I just thought it was interesting. So a few of those notes were that noblemen dressed colorfully in light blue, saffron, green, and red. Men also wore jackets called dolman that were often decorated with embroidery of silver or gold threads. Women's headdresses, which were either called bonnets or coifs, were wrapped or shaped with a stiffened layer of either wood or felt, and then they always had decorated trim, beading, and embroidery. Looking at art and garments that remain from this era, it's clear to see that Guéroud had done his utmost to capture the grandeur and glory of the costuming of this era. And, we keep watching movies that he's done the costuming for, and I think this is probably his best. I still cannot forgive him for The Three Musketeers, because the costuming in that was just a lot of yikes, but the costuming in this was so solid, and so many of those the collars and the finery that the Countess wore, I was like, oh, I want that. And also, I mean, Daniel Bruhl looked pretty great in his outfits.
I think he's a very interesting costume designer, and that it kind of feels like you can tell when he cares or does not care about the film.
And what's so fascinating about Guéroud is that he is so well known for his historical costuming, and yet he also does the costuming for Bourne Identity.
Fascinating.
I don't get it.
Fascinating.
Maybe he was like, I've always wanted to work with Matt Damon. I'll do this one.
I really thought we were going to get through an episode without saying his name.
I'm sorry. I had to do it. Speaking of things that we've done, we have a cool announcement, right?
Yeah, we do.
So at the beginning of last year, Nicole and I decided to start writing this pilot for a series that we'd kind of loosely bounced the idea around for a little while. And we finished it in about a month. Also have like a whole show book for it and everything, which is cool. But we started submitting it to contests just to kind of see what people think. And Nicole, would you like to say what we have done?
Yeah. So the funniest thing about this is that I genuinely had forgotten that you had submitted us for this. But it's I want to make sure I get this right. It's the Richmond International Film Festival. Is that all that it is?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. I always want to put like another word into it. Okay. So we found out that we placed as semifinalists in the Richmond International Film Festival's competition for, I believe, what was our category? Teleplay?
Teleplays, yes.
Yeah. Which is incredibly exciting. Whenever we found out that we were quarterfinalists, I like couldn't believe it. So the fact that we got to be semifinalists is just absolutely incredible. And
I was so nervous.
I just did not expect that it would go anywhere. We sort of wrote it just as a quarantine project, and it's only the second script I've ever worked on. Obviously,
also with me
from Maggie. Yeah, exactly. To get it to what it is, but we're very proud of it, and honestly, like, we'll see, where it goes.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to start submitting it to some more stuff and build up accolades for it so that get the word out, because it's a very unique script, and like I feel like if you read the log line and the description, you'd be like, huh, but then when you actually read the script, you're like, oh, that really works. So I have lots of dreams for it, and I'll always believe in it. So
yeah, it really feels like our child just like went off and got an award at school or something. But yeah, so we wanted to share the good news with all of our listeners.
Yes. This is something very fun, among all of the bad news in the world. It was a nice little bright spot.
And amongst all this murder that we talked to you about.
Murder. Not to cross over with my favorite murder, but stay sexy, don't get murdered.
Well, thank you so much for listening to our 26th episode of Petticoats and Poppies History Girls at the Movies.
We'd love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you think of the Countess.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie at Maggie of the Town. You can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Earglue Media website, and on Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcast or over on Podchaser. Every few episodes, we'll be reading our reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you'd like to be featured.
We'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective. Until then, stay safe and healthy, and don't get murdered.
I just want to let you know that I did wear my Zemo socks for today's episode. You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies,
History Girls at the Movies. Let's talk about some murder of virgins. Jesus.